Here are the top 10 things that we learned from the Colonial Pipeline shutdown and subsequent gasoline shortage. Number 1, speed now equals capabilities later. One of the very first things we noticed is just how quickly we went from a completely normal-ish energy situation to utter chaos almost immediately. In the states that have been hit hardest, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, we saw about a 3-day latency from the time the pipeline went down until the overwhelming majority of gas stations in the affected area were completely bone dry. In our specific area, it was about 24 hours until we started noticing lines forming. This is why it is absolutely crucial to act immediately on these sorts of things, particularly when it comes to pipelines going down, and why it was a smart move to immediately drop what you were doing and go get gasoline as soon as we realized this event was happening. I myself personally left work and was on my way to a gas station within 5 minutes of hearing that the pipeline was offline. It was that serious of an issue. And within 30 minutes, I had returned home and was back at a gas station filling up containers for some staff members here who couldn't immediately make it to a gas station to make sure that they were covered. And for those of you who acted on our alerts and other people's alerts, you know how solid of a move that was because gas dried up very quickly. Number 2 is that today it might have been hackers, but tomorrow it might be Uncle Sam. As much as we sound like a broken record or even turn some people off for criticizing the government all the time, this part is really crucial. When it comes to something as serious as gasoline, aviation fuel, diesel, and other petroleum products, the citizens of this country are at the bottom of the list of importance for products like these. The COVID crisis resulted in the normalization of things like rationing, segregation, government overreach, curfews, and the deployment of military assets on U.S. soil with the sole mission of targeting Americans who disobey the government. That sounds quite scary to say it like that, and it should be motivating enough for you to make decisions. Because when it comes down to choosing whether a gallon of gasoline goes into a congressperson's car or into your car, I think we all know how that situation is going to shake out, and that decision will be forced upon you at the end of a gun barrel. So we must realize that particularly gasoline shortages don't have to happen for very long before very serious things start happening. In less than 6 days, the overwhelming majority, the supermajority, over 2/3 of gas stations on the East Coast were completely out of gas. Can you imagine what would happen if the pipeline was offline for just another week? Just 2 weeks? Plus, now governments at all levels know that gasoline is a vulnerability for the population. But not for themselves, a vulnerability that can and will be exploited. Right now, we cannot ignore the fact that federal governmental forces are using this gasoline shortage as a way of controlling people. And in the future, we cannot rule out the possibility of federal forces seizing control of private commercial infrastructure and turning off the taps to ensure compliance. Even 2 months ago, I would personally say this is crazy. This is an extremely remote possibility, even for the dictatorial style of political leadership we seem to have right now. But we have been watching governmental actions, specifically the actions of the executive branch, and based on their response to this gas shortage, we are seeing indications and warnings that the next time a shortage happens, it might not be the actions of an external actor. Number 3, gasoline rotation is crucial. This is something that a lot of preppers have been doing for years, ourselves included to a certain extent. And this concept is gasoline storage and rotation. That is, always ensuring that you have enough gasoline stored so that at any given time, you always have as much gasoline on hand as possible. And by rotating out your older gas and refilling empty cans with fresh gas, you can always be sure that you have the freshest possible, and therefore the longest lasting with a preservative, gasoline on hand when the shortage occurs. We will have another separate video on how this whole process works coming out soon, so stay tuned for that. Number 4 is conflict at the pump. Looking back at this recent gas shortage, it only took a couple of days before people started physically attacking each other in the gas lines. So what we have seen is a cascading snowball of various events that result in exponential rise in risk. For instance, people who are stuck sitting in a gas line are already by default at a disadvantage. They most likely have an almost empty fuel tank, so they can't get very far if they had to egress, and even so, aggressive tactical driving would kill what little gas they had left. Plus, the nature of sitting in a gas line means reduced maneuverability, and therefore increased ambush potential. Additionally, the other people in line are also desperate for fuel, so there's an element of conflict right there already. And then you add in even more vulnerability when you finally get to a gas pump, because your situational awareness is reduced because you're conducting a task, and now you're physically tethered to the ground via the fuel hose that's inside your vehicle. And the longer you take, the more impatient the person behind you gets, because they start thinking, well, what if there isn't enough fuel for me when I get up to the pump? Then sprinkle over the top of this whole situation the fact that there is zero cover or concealment at pretty much every gas station in the world. Oh, and the entire nature of the whole infrastructure means that explosives are everywhere around you. When you look at it like this, it is an absolute miracle more people haven't been killed at gas stations during this shortage. Number 5 is a stranger's incompetence could kill you. People filling up trash bags and Tupperware containers might just seem like incompetence, but I would feel pretty differently if I was parked next to them and therefore was inside the blast radius if something were to go wrong. Just scrolling through social media, one can find pictures of people doing stupid stuff at the gas pump, but honestly, the person taking the picture is just as dumb, because rather than do something like alert an attendant or even just move their vehicle out of the way, some people would much rather take photos and make snarky comments on Twitter while they themselves are just as dumb for continuing to stay in a risky situation by standing next to an explosive situation. Number 6 is gas can shortages. As anyone who has grown up in the coastal mid-Atlantic region can tell you, every year, as soon as the weatherman hops on TV and says that a hurricane is on its way, it seems like everybody goes out and buys a brand new gas can. Happens every time, every single year. So pretty much any time people are most desperate for fuel because of a shortage or weather or some other kind of disaster, this is the least likely time in which they will be able to find an actual gas can to put it in, even if by some chance they're able to find gas in the first place. So even if you do not want to or can't store gasoline at your residence, it would be a very smart idea to at least keep an empty gas can in the back of your vehicle just in case. Number 7 is slightly inconvenienced people do desperate things. In today's world, things are pretty crazy to say the least. I personally would have to be in pretty dire straits before I resorted to siphoning gas from someone else's car. Like, the end of the world would have to happen before I would do that, because that's not something I morally approve of. However, in today's world, and among certain social and cultural groups in society, the threshold for theft and violence is much, much lower. We have an entire social movement that thinks that theft, arson, looting, and even things like murder and genocide are perfectly acceptable if they don't get their way. We live in a world where 3 guilty verdicts isn't good enough, and where a police officer stopping a murder is not okay because knife fights are totally normal, right? When reality has become this distorted, as it is in the United States right now, what exactly do you think the threshold is for someone killing you to get a full tank of gas? When a large portion of society views murder and genocide as perfectly acceptable, I don't think any of these people would have any qualms about siphoning your gas tank, or more likely, just stealing the entire car. But in the case of the former, a locking gas cap would be a pretty good deterrent against an unprepared gas thief. Number 8 is siphoning tools. And speaking of siphoning gas, having some sort of siphon or even just a length of plastic tubing can be a real lifesaver in the event that you have to transfer your fuel to another vehicle. For me, I have 2 vehicles, so if a shortage were to occur, and for some reason one of my vehicles was empty, I could easily siphon gas out of the full tank and into the other vehicle. And this is exactly what I personally did during the latest fuel crisis. I had one vehicle which is decently fuel efficient, so I siphoned gas from the less fuel efficient vehicle over to the other one to top off the tanks of the vehicle that I might have to use to egress. And in that case, if I were to have to egress and leave one of my vehicles behind, I personally plan to use a scorched earth policy in my particular emergency egress situation and based on where I live right now. If I cannot take it with me, I would much rather siphon the gas out of the tank of my vehicle I'm I'm leaving behind and give it to someone else who might need it. This also helps me in that I would not want to leave a full tank of gas behind for the mob to steal. I would absolutely pour it out on the ground before I let an activist group take it. This also ensures that when someone eventually does steal the vehicle I left behind, they can't get very far with it. Also, siphons are absolutely mandatory in the event that you are injured, or perhaps not as physically capable of actually lifting a fuel can up to refuel your tank. A 5-gallon metal gas can weighs over 40 pounds, and when fueling you have to hold it at an awkward angle anyway. So if you had a siphoning hose, you could simply leave your gas can in the back of your vehicle and siphon it into the tank that way. This is exactly what I do anyway, since in my neighborhood I've got a lot of nosy neighbors, and many of them with activist mentalities and hostile intentions. So when I'm fueling up my vehicle at night, it is a lot less sketchy to leave the gas can inside the car where it can't be seen by an outsider walking by, and running the hose out of the back of the vehicle and into the tank. Sure, to the observant person walking by, they can figure out what I'm doing pretty easily if they're watching closely, but it's a lot less obvious than holding a bright red, very large gas can in an awkward manner while having to reduce my situational awareness because I'm having to watch to make sure that I don't spill any. You see how this might present a security issue? Number 9, gasoline shortages affect everything, not just consumers. A lot of people shrugged off the gasoline shortage because they think it really only affects the consumer. For instance, aircraft can add in other stops if there is an aviation fuel shortage, simply refueling in a place where there isn't a shortage. And public services like fire trucks and ambulances, well, they're diesel powered anyway, so they're unaffected, right? Well, the problem is in the details. Yes, large commercial aircraft can add in stops, but what about your local medical transport helicopters? Their range is already very short compared to a commercial passenger aircraft, and in the majority of the area hit hardest by the shortage, most medical transport helicopters do not have the range to fly somewhere else to fuel. Anywhere they could fly to, it has a fuel shortage too. Likewise, when it comes to fire trucks and ambulances, yes, most of them are diesel powered. But with fire departments learning from the Minneapolis riots, in which firefighters were attacked as they tried to put out fires, many departments are not able to respond to incidents without police protection. Police protection that relies on gasoline-powered squad cars. No fuel for police cars, no police escort for fire trucks, you get no fire trucks. Fortunately, in this latest shortage, it was over comparatively quickly, right as the public service industry was starting to make plans around the fuel shortage. But remember, just because we made it through this one by the skin of our teeth does not mean we'll be so lucky next time. And number 10, risk management is not paranoia. These days, somehow it seems like we've come full circle. During the COVID crisis last year, or the year of the prepper as we like to call it, preppers were cool. It was almost a fashion statement to be a prepper, which, despite the fashion context, we thought was pretty cool. Like, we thought, hey, at least people are starting to get a little bit more preparedness and self-reliance minded, which is a good thing. Well, now, in the current political climate we're in, we're starting to go right back to the way things were, plus a little extra. See, if people prepare for things, this is a de facto acknowledgement that the government cannot meet the needs of the people, and in classic Stalin-esque logic, we must not prepare for things because preparing for things means that things will go bad, and the government can never do anything bad. You see how this goes? So as a result of this politicization, by fixing a problem, we admit that there is a problem, which is not something that is tolerated by a certain group of people. Right now, within federal government, it seems like the prevailing doctrine for a lot of issues is that we're going to ignore the problem because if we fix the problem, we acknowledge that there was a problem, which we just can't have. So here we are in a societal pickle where to prepare means to survive, but a large portion of society and the entire government doesn't want that. Plus, right now, it's hard to have the finances to prepare, especially in this economy, and not to mention families being divided over ideology and social issues to a breaking point at times. So, all in all, we're fighting a multi-front conflict just to survive. All of this is not being said to be a downer, right now we've got a lot more than our fair share of those, but it also pays to recognize that managing your risk, making the best decisions that you know how with the information you have, is not simply being paranoid. So don't get wrapped up with what other people think, but also don't cause problems for yourself later because you overdid something a little bit. It's all a balance, preparing enough to manage your risk and increase your capabilities in a crisis, but not so much that you end up neglecting other things. So those are the top 10 things that we learned from the latest fuel shortage crisis. Of course, there are probably more than 10 lessons learned, we just didn't think of them while writing them down. So if you think of a lesson that you learned, write it in the comment section below or drop it in our other platforms platforms as well. We can all benefit from shared information for sure, especially these days. But that's all we've got for today. Make sure to follow us on all of our other platforms, and a special thank you again to our Patreon supporters who make videos like this possible. And with that, we will see you next time. And always remember to fight in the shade.